John and Sarah Johnson were the kind of couple everyone envied: successful, charming, and seemingly perfect. But beneath their immaculate suburban life was a chilling reality. Sarah was trapped in a web of fear and manipulation, and John's polished facade hid dark secrets that would shatter their family forever. John and Sarah Johnson lived in a picturesque neighborhood that seemed straight out of a magazine. Their home, a pristine colonial style house with a bright white exterior and a perfectly manicured lawn, was the envy of the block. Passersby often commented on the charm of the family. John, the successful businessman, always seemed to be rushing off to an important meeting, but not before waving warmly to his neighbors. Sarah, ever the gracious hostess, was known for her delicious baked goods and warm, welcoming smile. Together, they were the couple everyone aspired to emulate, and their two children, Emily and Ethan, only added to the illusion of perfection. Emily, at 16, was a bright and ambitious high school student who excelled in academics and extracurriculars. She had a natural talent for art and spent hours sketching landscapes in the family's sunroom. Ethan, several years younger, was a bundle of energy, always riding his bike through the cul-de-sac or playing soccer with the other kids on the block. To anyone looking in, the Johnsons had it all: a beautiful home, successful careers, and a happy family life. But those who spent time with them began to notice subtle cracks in the glossy exterior. Sarah rarely spoke about her personal life, though she was always quick to lend an ear to others. While she attended community events and PTA meetings, there was a certain guardedness about her. It was as if she carried an invisible weight, though she worked hard to hide it. John, on the other hand, was outgoing and charismatic. He had a knack for making everyone around him feel important, yet there was an edge to his charm that some found unsettling. Mrs. Callahan, their elderly next-door neighbor, often described him as too perfect. She noticed that while John was always polite, there was a coldness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. Inside the walls of the Johnson home, the reality was far from perfect. John's personality shifted dramatically when the front door closed. The man who seemed so genial in public was domineering and quick-tempered at home. Sarah bore the brunt of his moods, often enduring his scathing criticisms and demands without protest. She worked tirelessly to maintain the image of a loving wife, ensuring the house was immaculate and the children well-behaved. But no matter how hard she tried, it was never enough for John. The children were not oblivious to the tension. Emily noticed the way her mother flinched when her father raised his voice, or how she avoided eye contact when he was in one of his moods. Ethan, too young to understand fully, would often retreat to his room, finding solace in his toys. For them, the house felt more like a pressure cooker than a home. Despite everything, Sarah kept up appearances. She convinced herself that she could manage, that things would get better. After all, wasn't every marriage full of compromises? But deep down, she knew something was wrong. Terribly wrong. The cracks in the Johnson family's facade became more apparent as time went on. Sarah's days were filled with a quiet unease that never seemed to dissipate. She often replayed moments in her head, searching for answers to questions she didn't dare ask out loud. The seeds of doubt had been planted months earlier when her close friend mentioned seeing John with another woman at a downtown restaurant. At first, Sarah dismissed the comment, convincing herself it must have been a misunderstanding. But the doubt lingered, growing stronger each time John came home late without an explanation or spent hours locked away in his study. Sarah began keeping a journal, a small leather-bound book she hid in the back of her closet. In it, she documented everything. The nights John didn't come home until after midnight, the strange phone calls he took in hushed tones, and the arguments that seemed to erupt over the smallest things. Writing became her only outlet, a way to process the turmoil she couldn't share with anyone else. Each entry revealed a deeper fear, an unsettling realization that the man she had married was not the person she thought he was. Emily, the oldest child, started noticing the tension as well. Though her parents tried to shield her and Ethan from the worst of it, there were things that couldn't be hidden. Emily saw how her mother's hands trembled when setting the dinner table, or how her father's voice turned icy when he was displeased. Emily began avoiding family meals, preferring to eat alone in her room, where she could escape the heavy atmosphere that seemed to weigh down the entire house. Outside the family, the Johnsons maintained their polished image. John continued to charm neighbors and colleagues, presenting himself as the loving husband and dedicated father. He attended school events and even volunteered to coach Ethan's soccer team. Sarah, though quieter, remained the dutiful wife, smiling through her discomfort and deflecting questions about her well-being. But not everyone was fooled. Mrs. Callahan, their next-door neighbor, had grown increasingly suspicious. From her living room window, she noticed subtle changes. The way Sarah avoided making eye contact with anyone, or the moments when John's voice carried through the thin walls, sharp and angry. One night, Mrs. Callahan heard an argument that sent chills down her spine. The voices were muffled, but she could clearly hear the tension. The next morning, Sarah emerged from the house with a bruise on her wrist, which she quickly covered with a long-sleeved blouse. Mrs. Callahan debated whether to say something, but ultimately decided against it, reasoning that it wasn't her place to interfere. As the days passed, the tension in the Johnson home reached a boiling point. Emily, unable to ignore the growing unease, started paying closer attention. She noticed patterns in her father's behavior. The way he always seemed to be on edge, the times he disappeared for hours without explanation. Though she didn't fully understand what was happening, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. The unraveling of the Johnson family began with a discovery that Sarah never anticipated. One afternoon, while John was out, Sarah was cleaning his study, a room he guarded fiercely. It was a space she rarely entered, knowing his volatile temper would flare if she disrupted his belongings. But on that day, compelled by an intuition she couldn't ignore, she opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Beneath a pile of invoices and business documents, she found a folder marked Confidential. Inside were financial records that made her blood run cold. Bank statements revealed that their joint savings account, which should have been enough to secure their family's future, was nearly empty. Worse still, there were substantial loans taken out in her name, loans she had no knowledge of. Panic set in as she realized the enormity of what these documents implied. John had not only been draining their finances, but had also tied her to debts she hadn't agreed to. Sarah felt a mix of fear and betrayal. She had always known John was controlling, but this was different. This wasn't just about power. It was about survival. She quickly gathered the documents and tucked them away in a hidden compartment in her closet, knowing she would need them as evidence if things took a darker turn. While Sarah grappled with this newfound information, Emily stumbled upon her own revelation. She had always sensed the tension between her parents, but it wasn't until she found her mother's journal that she began to piece together the full extent of what was happening. Emily hadn't meant to invade her mother's privacy. She was looking for a sketchbook in Sarah's closet when the leather-bound journal caught her eye. Curiosity got the better of her, and as she flipped through the pages, her heart sank. The entries detailed years of emotional abuse, financial manipulation, and moments of sheer terror. Emily couldn't believe what she was reading. The father she had admired, despite his flaws, was a far cry from the man described in those pages. She felt a deep sense of anger and helplessness, but also an overwhelming need to protect her mother and younger brother. Emily began taking matters into her own hands. She started recording her father's outbursts on her phone, discreetly capturing moments when his mask slipped and his true nature emerged. She knew that if they were ever going to escape this nightmare, they needed proof that the charming man everyone else saw was a facade. Meanwhile, Mrs. Callahan's suspicions grew. One night, she saw John in the backyard, digging under the cover of darkness. It struck her as odd, especially since the area he was working in was already landscaped. She debated calling the police, but decided to wait, unsure of what she had truly witnessed. The next morning, she noticed Sarah wearing long sleeves again, despite the warm weather. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, though none of the women fully understood the danger they were in. Each was uncovering a part of John's dark secret, but the full picture was far more sinister than they could have imagined. The cold November night that marked the breaking point in the Johnson household began like many others. heavy with tension and unease. Dinner had been silent, with Sarah quietly picking at her plate and John dominating the room with his presence. His mood was unpredictable that evening, his piercing gaze darting between Sarah and the children as though searching for some hidden betrayal. Emily, ever observant, could tell something was simmering beneath the surface, a storm ready to explode at any moment. Later that night, John's paranoia came to a head. Sarah was folding laundry in their bedroom when he burst through the door, his face twisted with anger. He accused her of plotting against him, convinced that her recent quietness and withdrawn demeanor were signs of disloyalty. His accusations grew more erratic, his voice rising with each sentence. Sarah tried to reason with him, her words measured and calm, but it only seemed to enrage him further. He grabbed her phone, demanding to see her messages, and when she hesitated, he smashed it against the wall. Upstairs, Emily and Ethan huddled together in fear. Emily had seen this side of her father before, but never with such intensity. She knew she had to act, but her options felt limited. She reached for her phone, her hands trembling, and began recording the commotion downstairs. Her heart raced as she tried to think of what to do next. Calling the police felt risky. What if they didn't believe her? What if it made things worse? Meanwhile, John locked Sarah in the bedroom, storming out and slamming the door behind him. Trapped, Sarah felt a mix of panic and despair. She knew this wasn't just a bad night. It was the culmination of years of abuse, and she couldn't endure it any longer. She had to protect herself and her children, but she didn't know how. Unbeknownst to Sarah, Emily had already taken the first step. Earlier that week, she had shared one of her recordings with Mrs. Callahan, the neighbor who had always been kind to her family. Emily hadn't told her everything, but explained enough for Mrs. Callahan to understand the gravity of the situation. That night, when Mrs. Callahan heard the yelling from next door, she didn't hesitate. She called the police, reporting what she suspected was domestic violence. When the officers arrived, John greeted them at the door, his charm fully intact. He assured them it was just a misunderstanding, a private family matter blown out of proportion. But Emily stepped forward, her phone in hand, and played one of the recordings. It was enough to make the officers take Sarah aside to hear her side of the story. Shaking, Sarah showed them the financial documents she had hidden and the bruises on her wrist. That night, John was arrested. As he was led away in handcuffs, he shot Sarah a look that sent chills down her spine. It wasn't over. Not yet. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt the weight of his control begin to lift. She clutched her children tightly, knowing their fight was far from finished, but hoping it was the beginning of a new chapter. In the weeks following John's arrest, the Johnson family's life took a dramatic turn. The once pristine home that symbolized their perfect facade now stood as a haunting reminder of what they had endured. For Sarah, Emily, and Ethan, the days were filled with police interviews, legal proceedings, and the slow, painful process of unpacking years of trauma. But as the investigation deepened, the full extent of John's actions came to light, revealing a far more sinister story than any of them had imagined. The financial documents Sarah had discovered were only the tip of the iceberg. Detectives found that John had embezzled significant sums from his company over the past 5 years, siphoning funds into offshore accounts. He had used Sarah's name and credit to cover his tracks, ensuring that if his schemes were ever uncovered, she would bear the brunt of the blame. As investigators pieced together the evidence, it became clear that John's controlling behavior extended beyond the family. He had manipulated colleagues, falsified records, and threatened anyone who dared to question him. What shocked Sarah the most was learning about John's connections to a local criminal network. The woman Sarah's friend had seen him with at the restaurant was not a romantic partner, but an accomplice in his fraudulent activities. Together, they had orchestrated a series of scams that preyed on vulnerable individuals, leaving many in financial ruin. The evidence against John mounted, painting a picture of a man whose charm masked a cold, calculating nature. While the legal battle unfolded, Mrs. Callahan's observations became a crucial part of the investigation. She told detectives about the night she saw John digging in the backyard, prompting them to obtain a warrant to search the property. What they found was chilling: a hidden safe buried beneath the garden. Inside were forged documents, stacks of cash, and even more evidence linking John to his criminal activities. The discovery was a turning point in the case, solidifying the charges against him. For Sarah, the revelations were both a relief and a source of deep pain. The man she had once loved, the father of her children, had orchestrated a web of lies and deceit that nearly destroyed them. But amid the heartache, there was also a sense of liberation. The truth was finally out, and for the first time, she and her children had the chance to rebuild their lives. Emily, too, found a sense of empowerment in the aftermath. Her recordings had been instrumental in exposing John's abusive behavior, and she took solace in knowing she had helped protect her family. Ethan, still young, struggled to understand the full scope of what had happened, but leaned on his mother and sister for support. Together, the three of them began to forge a new path, one rooted in honesty and healing. John was ultimately convicted on multiple charges, including fraud, domestic abuse, and coercion. As he was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The nightmare was over. Though scars remained, the Johnsons were free from the grip of a man who had controlled their lives for far too long. They moved out of the house that had held so many painful memories, ready to start anew. The community, led by Mrs. Callahan, rallied around them. What had once been a story of hidden suffering became a testament to resilience and courage. Sarah and her children had faced unimaginable challenges, but they emerged stronger, determined to build a future free from fear. The Johnsons' story became a stark reminder of the darkness that can hide behind even the most polished exteriors, and the strength it takes to uncover the truth.